Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Amanda Kramer, and I'm the Alumni Engagement Program Manager at the University of Colorado Boulder's Leeds School of Business. Welcome back to our 5th COVID-19 webinar series. These are certainly trying times, and here at CU Boulder, we have gathered our world-renowned faculty to provide frank and timely insights for life during the COVID-19 pandemic. Today is the third of 4 webinars in this COVID-19 related webinar series. To view upcoming webinars, please visit our website at colorado.edu/business/alumni. Click the drop-down arrow and click Attend Online Webinars. For today's webinar, we're so excited to welcome Leeds Professor of Marketing, Dr. Phil Fernbach, here presenting The Knowledge Illusion, Our Current Political Climate During COVID-19. A few housekeeping items before we begin. First, if you have any questions now or during the presentation that you would like to ask Phil, please send a question through the Q&A interface. We will monitor questions as they are submitted, and Phil will respond to them at the end of the presentation. As a reminder, for optimum audio quality, we do have everyone on mute except for myself and our speaker. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please notify us through the chat interface, and one of our support specialists will touch base. Lastly, a link to access the webinar recording will be sent to all registrants tomorrow, along with the survey link and supplemental resources from today's presentation. Now, I'm excited to introduce today's speaker. Phil Fernbach is a professor of marketing in the Leeds School of Business at the University of Colorado Boulder. He is a cognitive scientist who studies how people think, and he applies insights from his research to improve public discourse and help consumers and managers make better decisions. He is co-director of the Center for Research on Consumer Financial Decision-Making, an affiliate of the Institute of Cognitive Science and the Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility, and an external advisory board member for McKinsey & Company. He teaches data analytics and behavioral science to undergraduate and master's students. Fernbach is the co-author of the 2017 book, The Knowledge Illusion, Why We Never Think Alone, which was chosen as an editor's pick by the New York Times. The book explores why we think we know so much more than we do, and the profound implications for individuals and society. Fernbach received his PhD in cognitive science from the Department of Cognitive, Linguistic, and Psychological Sciences at Brown University. Prior to pursuing his PhD, he completed his undergraduate studies at Williams College in the mountains of Western Massachusetts, where he studied philosophy. Welcome, Phil, and thank you so much for being here. I'm going to hand the webinar over to you now.
Thanks, Amanda. Really appreciate being here. Can you hear me? Is everything functional? All right, I'm going to assume that's a yes. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us for this webinar. I'm really pleased to share some of my research and thoughts and ideas. Man, these are crazy times that we're living in right now. And my hope is that I will provide you with some ideas about how to make sense, at least make a little bit of sense of some of the dimensions of our experience these days. We're going to start in kind of a funny place. We're going to start by talking about toilets of all things. There's a really great set of studies done by a psychologist by the name of Frank Kyle in the 1990s at Yale. And Kyle was really interested in what we sort of know about everyday objects. How much do we know about them? And what's really fun about this study is that we can kind of do the experiment. While you guys are sitting there listening to the webinar, we can sort of walk through the experiment. So the first thing that I'm going to do in this experiment is I'm going to ask you to think about how well you understand how something works. And my favorite example is this toilet, okay? I don't want you to think too hard about it. I just want you to think about what's that initial impression that you have. And if you're like most people, you're sort of nodding your head and saying, yeah, I have a decent idea of how a toilet works. You think that somewhere inside your head is something that's analogous to this plumbing diagram here that you see on the screen. But here's the trick of the study. What I'm going to do in the next phase of the study is I'm going to ask you to actually explain it to me in detail. Explain to me exactly how the toilet works. And when I do that, something pretty amazing happens. This is what happens. people reach inside and they realize that they know next to nothing. But that initial impression we have is that we feel that we understand things in some detail. Then we try to explain and we realize, wow, I actually know a lot less than I thought I did. This is what in the book we call the knowledge illusion. The more sort of technical term in the cognitive science literature is the illusion of explanatory depth. This sense that we understand things in the world more deeply than we do. Maybe you're a plumber and this example didn't really work for you. You actually do know how a toilet works. Well, let me give you another example here. Bicycles. This comes from a study that was done by a psychologist named Rebecca Lawson in 2006. She had the best title I've ever seen for a psychology paper. She called it Psychology with a C. And what Lawson did in this study was she asked, how well do people understand the mechanism of a bicycle? Now, this is a fun one because we all ride around on our bicycles all the time. This is an object that we have tons of experience with all the time. And she gave people a pretty easy task. In the center of the screen here is a model of how a bicycle actually functions. And what Lawson did was she gave people a diagram kind of like this, but it was missing a few of the pieces. And she simply asked people to draw those things in. So it was missing the chain and parts of the frame and the pedals. And she just said, okay, draw those objects in. Should be pretty easy task, right? We all mess around with our bicycles all the time. Obviously, we know a little something about where the pieces go. It actually turns out that this isn't an easy task at all. It's incredibly difficult. And here are some of the examples from her study of people's attempts to draw a bicycle. And they're pretty comical when you look at how far off they are from the actual functioning of a bicycle. But what's amazing about this thing is that these examples aren't cherry-picked at all. This is sort of the average performance on this task. People have a really, really hard time with it, despite the fact that this is an object that we interact with all the time. I find this to be a pretty amazing result. There was a pretty cool thing that happened a few months ago, was that there was an Italian artist by the name of Gemini who independently discovered this effect. He actually, I don't think, was aware of Lawson's work, but he realized that all of his friends who were tooling around on their bicycles all the time actually had no idea how it worked. And he decided to create an art installation out of this idea. And the first thing he did was he had people try to draw bicycles, his friends. And what you get is results that look very similar to what Lawson found in her study. But then he took it a step further and actually went ahead and built the bikes, which is pretty amazing. So you get these crazy Salvador Dali or MC Escher type constructions. And what I really like about this example is, to me, an art installation is effective when it captures something really deep about the human experience. And I think that this idea really does. And I'm going to try to explain why I think that is as we move forward. Now, the reason that we got really interested in this idea of the illusion of understanding, or the knowledge illusion, or the illusion of explanatory depth, is because we don't think it's really about bicycles and toilets, but that it's really about the most important issues that we grapple with as a society and as individuals. This idea of overestimating our understanding ends up being really, really important for a lot of different topics that we deal with. And one of my favorite quotes on this idea was by Bertrand Russell, the brilliant mathematician and philosopher. And he said, "The opinions that are held with passion are always those for which no good ground exists." And the idea here is that when we overestimate our understanding of how the world works, it supports opinions and beliefs about the world that are stronger than they should be. And this is a pretty intuitive idea. We decided to actually study this idea in the domain of politics and political opinions. And we ran a study several years ago looking at whether this kind of illusion of explanatory depth actually supports political opinions that are stronger than they should be. And what we did was we looked at some of the issues that were sort of the hot button issues of the day. Things like a national flat tax, whether that should be instituted, whether we should have a cap and trade system for carbon emissions, whether we should impose unilateral sanctions on Iran for its nuclear program, and so on. And what we did was we brought people into the lab and we essentially ran the toilet experiment on them. People come in and we ask them to express opinions about these issues, and people were pretty happy to express pretty strong opinions about these issues. But then we had them try to explain how these issues work. And what happened was very similar to what happens when we ask people to try to explain a toilet. People try to explain and they fail. They have very, very little to say. In general, people could maybe come up with one sentence soundbite for a lot of these issues. And what happens is people realize that they don't understand these issues as well as they thought they did. We also found that after trying to explain, people backed off their positions a little bit. They became a little bit more moderate. It's like people were saying, well, I actually don't understand this as well as I thought I did, and therefore I'm not really justified in having such a strong opinion about it. So some of the extremity in our public discourse is really supported by this sense that we understand things more deeply than we do. Now, I'm hoping some of this is resonating for you guys as we're talking, because I want to eventually transition into talking a little bit about the political climate today, and maybe how we could think about having more productive discourse than we do. And we'll probably get into some of that in the Q&A as we go along. Another area where we've studied these ideas, and one of my favorite areas of study, is controversial scientific topics. We have a lot of scientific technologies and scientific findings where there's a huge gap between what the experts believe, what the scientists say. There might be a scientific consensus on an issue, and the way the public feels about the issue. Things like climate change or vaccination is a very key one that we're grappling with right now. And one of my favorite topics is genetically modified foods. I love to study genetically modified foods because I get a lot of people really annoyed at me in Boulder, which is kind of fun. Generates a lot of controversy. But it turns out that the safety of genetically modified foods is a consensus issue among scientists. And despite that, it's something that there's a huge proportion of the population that feels very uncomfortable with genetically modified foods. They think they're unsafe. They don't want to consume them. And what we did in our study, looking at this issue, was we measured how strongly people oppose GMOs. And then we asked them two sets of questions. One set of questions was gauging their actual science knowledge. How well do they understand science? And how well do they understand genetics and GMOs objectively? So we asked them actual objective facts and see if they get them right. The other thing we asked people was, how well do you feel like you understand GMOs? That's subjective knowledge. And what you see in these data is a pretty remarkable pattern. People who are the most extremely opposed to GMOs have the lowest science literacy and have the lowest genetics literacy. That is, they have the worst objective understanding of the issue, but they feel like they understand it the best. So on the right, you see the subjective knowledge going up as the extremity of opposition goes up. So if you put these two things together, it's a pretty profound result. And in fact, the title of the paper is exactly what the result is. Those who know the extremists think they know the most, but actually know the least. And so again, what we're seeing is that this overestimation of knowledge is underscoring, it's supporting these extreme opinions. And in particular, in this case, supporting extreme opinions that are counter to the scientific consensus. We actually find this not just in the USA, but in Europe as well. And in fact, I just saw a paper that replicated our result in China. So this is a really general phenomenon. Now that's GMOs. What we wanted to do in another study was look at a bunch of other issues. And we looked at climate change, genetically modified food, vaccination, nuclear power, homeopathic medicine, evolution, and the Big Bang. And these are all issues where there's a pretty big gap between what the scientists say and what the public believes. And we find overall the same results across all these studies, across all these issues, that as extremity of opposition to the scientific consensus view increases, objective knowledge goes down, but subjective knowledge goes up. Now, we did find some differences across issues, and I'm just going to quickly show you the data here. In one study, and these results differ a little bit by study, but there are some differences across issues that might or might not be interesting, and we're still sort of digging into that. But one thing we have found is that the climate change issue doesn't really show this pattern. And the reason we think that that is, by the way, the labels on here: Big Bang, climate change, evolution, genetically modified foods, homeopathic medicine, nuclear power, and vaccination. We found the strongest effects for what I would call secular issues. These are issues which are not really associated with a particular party or partisan affiliation. So the four on the right show the strongest effects, and those are the ones that aren't really politicized on partisan grounds. Evolution, climate change, and Big Bang are very partisan, and we think that that's part of the reason why they show a little bit of a different pattern. But overall, we think the general effect is pretty robust and pretty general. That when people have an anti-consensus view on science, they tend to have higher subjective knowledge and lower objective understanding of the issue. Pretty important idea. I'm just going to show you one more study, just because it's really timely. A few months ago, I was reading the New York Times, and I saw a Pew study saying that a very high proportion of the population is unwilling to, does not want to get a COVID vaccine when it's approved. Now, there's a bunch of stuff going on here, and so I don't want to suggest that that it's wrong to not want to get the COVID vaccine, especially right away, because there's some legitimate concern for sure about whether a vaccine might be rushed through despite not meeting the typical barriers of safety and efficacy. And that is a legitimate concern. But at the same time, what we were looking at in this study was whether the really extreme people opposed to the vaccine would show the same kind of pattern. And what we did was we asked people how willing they are to get the vaccine, assuming it's approved. And that's the question you're seeing here. And then we asked them, again, science literacy questions, both general science, but what I'm showing here are, it's a battery of questions about COVID specifically and how well people actually understand it. And we find the same result, that the people who are most opposed to the vaccine have the highest subjective knowledge. That is, they think they understand the COVID vaccine the best, but they have the actual lowest objective knowledge when it comes to understanding the facts about COVID. Again, pretty profound and pretty timely, right? Because, wow, like this is gonna be such an important issue as vaccination, as the vaccine starts becoming available. We don't just have the issue of the systems associated with producing and disseminating the vaccine, but we actually have really complicated psychology that could be a major barrier to actually having the vaccine widely available and taken and getting life back to normal. And again, I just want to underscore, if you are someone who is uncomfortable with taking the COVID vaccine right away, I'm not saying at all that you're crazy or anything like that. But what we are showing here is this same pattern, that the people who are most extreme in saying there's no way that I want this thing it's just an empirical fact that they have the lowest science literacy. They have the lowest science literacy, but the highest subjective knowledge. Okay, so that's a series of demonstrations that I hope have sort of got you thinking, wow, okay, this is pretty interesting. And one reaction that people often have when they see these kinds of results is kind of despair for humanity, right? They say, oh my God, people are such idiots. And this is like so disturbing, you know, that we are so ignorant, we know so little, and yet we think we know so much. It's really kind of distressing. And what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to try to dive a little into the cognitive science of where these effects come from and why they happen, and hopefully give you a more richer feeling about the reason for these effects, and actually to show you that these effects are not showing that people are stupid, but in fact, they're sort of foundational to what makes us really amazing as human beings. And so we shouldn't really despair, but we should really try to understand where these come from, and that'll give us some leverage in terms of trying to figure out how we might get to some ideas about how to improve our discourse and make better decisions and so on. And the idea that I'm going to talk about is really the subtitle of our book, which is Why We Never Think Alone. And keep that idea in mind as I go forward, and I try to lay out the argument for why I think these effects are happening, and why I think it's not a matter of people being stupid. I'm going to start by talking about this really cool study that was done by a psychologist named Thomas Landauer in the 1980s. And the point that I'm going to get to is the idea that the human mind just is not built for storing a lot of detailed information about the world. That's just not what it's for. And that's not what we're good at as human beings. To illustrate that idea, this study is really cool. Landauer was doing psychology at a time when people were taking a metaphor for the mind very seriously. The idea, computation and computer science was really just starting to hit its stride. And there was this very obvious idea that came about in the cognitive science world that the mind is like a kind of desktop computer that's doing computations and calculations, and that's how the mind works. And people started to take this idea really, really seriously. And they asked an interesting question, which was, how much knowledge is in a mind? And can we estimate that on the same, using the same metrics that we would use to estimate the memory size of a computer? And the typical memory metric that you guys are probably familiar with is a gigabyte, right? So how many gigabytes or terabytes or petabytes do we have in our minds? And what I really like about the study is just the cleverness. What Landauer did was he looked at the results of memory experiments, and in these experiments, what happens is a set of subjects studies some information. It might be words or lyrics to songs or pictures or bits of music. They study them. And then what happens is, after a delay, we ask them to regurgitate what they studied. Or we ask them a recall task. Have you seen this before? Okay, that's a little bit of an easier memory task. But what we can do with those data is we can estimate how fast people acquire knowledge and also how fast they forget. So we just take how much time did you spend studying, how much do you remember, and we can estimate those parameters. And then what Landauer did was he just made a simplifying assumption. Let's assume that you go through your life learning at that sort of average rate all the time that you're awake, and you live to age 70. Well, how much do you know at the end? That's a pretty cool way to get to an estimate. Now, of course, it's not a perfect estimate. It's a back of the envelope calculation that's not going to be exactly right, but it gives us a back of the envelope kind of ballpark figure. Now, I just want you to think about what you think that number is going to be. And I'm going to show you what it is. Okay? So just get an idea in your mind. How many terabytes is that going to be? Okay, here's the result. 1 gigabyte And he did the math several different ways and always came to more or less the same answer, 1 gigabyte. Now, just to give you some perspective on this, if you're holding a thumb drive in your hand right now, it's probably got 16 gigabytes. If it's a small one, it might have a terabyte, 1,000 gigabytes on it. Okay, so this number is pretty mind-blowing. And when I saw this number, it blew my mind. The human mind is just not made for storing a lot of detailed information. There's actually a really good reason for that, which is that the world is just endlessly complex. And if we tried to master everything in all its detail, we would just fail. There's just no way. So we just don't store a lot of detailed information. Let me give you another fun example of this. This is from a study looking at what students remember from chemistry class, or from a variety of classes, okay? Now this is the Krebs cycle. This is a diagram of the Krebs cycle, also called the citric acid cycle, which is one of the most important physiological reactions in nature. It's how cells generate energy. Now we all learned about this in high school biology or chemistry or college. So everybody's seen this before, believe it or not, because it's such an important a reaction in nature. And I'm going to show you what people remember just a few months after the course. Okay, this is what it actually looks like. It's really complicated, a lot going on. This is what people actually remember. I hope you're chuckling at your screens right now. My favorite part of this diagram that some student helpfully put together was that because this is called the citric acid cycle, they helpfully drew a lemon because that's a citrus fruit. But really, they have no memory whatsoever. If any of you are teachers like I am, this is something you really have to keep in mind. If we're going to try to stuff students' heads full of knowledge, like good luck, okay? People do not remember details. We just do not maintain a lot of detailed information. We do not retain it. And despite how important it is or how much time we spent studying it, it's gone pretty quickly. And again, that's because the human mind is just not built to store detailed information. So what is the mind good at and what's it for? The answer is also, I think, a pretty important idea. It turns out that what human beings really excel at and what makes us really special is not our capacity for individual thinking. It's not our ability to process a ton of information really fast. It's not our ability to retain a ton of facts, master tons of different areas, and so on. What it turns out makes us really special is our ability to engage in a kind of collaborative thinking. I'm going to show you a video real quick here. This is from work by a psychologist named Michael Tomasello, who studies comparative psychology. What they do in comparative psychology is they compare human beings' cognitive abilities to other kinds of animals. And in this case, Tomasello compares human children to chimpanzees and other apes that have really impressive cognitive capacities. And the question is, what is it that human children really do much better than those other species? And just to give you an example of what human children can really excel at that chimpanzees really can't do, here's an example. Okay, so just watch this video. And what you see here is a 1.5-year-old child who's involved. The experimenter has something in his hand. He can't open the door. And what you see is very cute. Child comes over and opens the door for him and then makes eye contact at the end as if to say, I got your back, fella. Now, if you're watching this video, one reaction you might have is like, well, of course, it's obvious. Like, it's pretty easy, not impressed. Good job, 1.5-year-old, but not impressed. I would argue that you should be really freaking impressed. That kid is 1.5 years old, almost can't even speak. And what's involved in the task right there is really, really challenging. The child has to appreciate that the experimenter has to have a goal. That is, the child has to understand that the experimenter has a mental state. The child has to appreciate that the experimenter does not have within his current capacity the ability to achieve his goal. And the child has to figure out how to coordinate his own action to actually jointly achieve the goal. It's a remarkable feat, actually. And it's something that really smart animals of other species really cannot do very well. And human children just excel at it. And our ability to engage in this kind of collaborative cognition is something that evolves and grows really, really rapidly over the course of development. Now, opening cabinets is one thing, but if you think about pretty much anything that humanity can do, it shows this remarkable capacity for collaborative thinking and collaborative problem solving. I just love this example of the Milan Cathedral, which is just one of the most beautiful and impressive buildings that humanity has built. The construction on this began in 1386, and the facade wasn't completed until Napoleon in the 1800s. It turns out that cathedrals have a punch list, like the final things that have to get done, like a home renovation. The punch list was finished in 1965. So actually it took 600 years for this thing to be built. And over the course of that building, there were 75 different chief engineers who were responsible for the project, and just thousands and thousands of people involved. Now, if you think about what any one individual knew about how to construct a cathedral, it was like one millionth of what was necessary to actually achieve the construction of this thing. This is a massively collaborative event, collaborative pursuit, where no one individual has remotely the capacity to do it. And yet, each of us, each knowing our own little piece and doing our own little job, and having this basic cognitive capacity for collaboration, we come together and we can accomplish tasks of just arbitrary complexity, like launching spaceships, building cathedrals, discovering fundamental particles, and so on. So that's the amazing thing about human cognition. This is really the secret to human thinking. One way to think about it is that we're a little like bees. And this is a very different way to think about human cognition. We normally think about how smart individuals are, how much we can do, how much we know, how much intelligence we have, and so on. But human cognition is a little bit like bees also. In a beehive, you have individuals who are each doing their own little specialized job. And yet the hive is incredibly complex. The hive ensures that it's defended from predators, that genetic diversity is introduced, that food is stored for the winter. It's really, really complicated. And it's not complicated because there's one really smart person or individual overseeing everything, but it emerges. It's a kind of emergent complexity that comes from everybody doing their own special little job. And that's kind of how human thinking is as well. We each have our own little slice of expertise. And you put it all together, and humanity can do really remarkable things. Okay, so that's the amazing thing about people. Now here's the dark side. The dark side is that when you think about what you know about any issue that you have to take a position on, and this is going to bring it back to politics, the implications of this different view of human cognition are really deep. And the implication is that it turns out that you do not yourself know enough about almost any issue to be able to actually justify what you believe about that issue. It turns out that most of the knowledge that supports what you believe is actually not stored in your own head. You can think about any political issue that's your favorite at the time. You yourself know probably very little about it, unless it's your special area of expertise and you spend a lot of time studying it. And yet, as a community, we have these really strong positions. The community says, this is what we believe, and the individuals in the community tend to support that really strongly. Now, the danger is that often we don't realize that the knowledge is not stored in our own heads. This is where we argue that the knowledge illusion comes from. By virtue of participating in this community of knowledge, we sort of channel what our group believes. And just by virtue of doing that, we sort of get this feeling that we ourselves understand the issue more deeply than we do. What happens is you hear your community saying one thing and you start nodding and you feel strongly about it because your neighbor feels strongly about it. But your neighbor feels strongly about it because you feel strongly about it. And this process is how we get to our beliefs about really complicated issues without ourselves having to know everything about the issue, which would be impossible because the world is too complex. But what it can lead to is a kind of house of cards situation where we all feel really strongly about something, but none of us really understands it very well. And I would argue that's a big part of what goes on these days in our polarized political environment and why we can't talk to one another and why we can't have productive discourse. Now, this can actually lead to some really outlandish places. And my favorite example is, this is me and my graduate student, Nick Light, when we visited the Flat Earth International Conference last year and spoke to people who literally believe that the earth is flat. I love this example because it's so fascinating to understand the psychology that underscores or undergirds how an entire community of people can come to believe that the earth is flat. But if you think about it, I would like you to just ask yourself the question for a second. How do you know the earth is round? And you might have seen some pictures, and that's probably the most difficult, most difficult kind of evidence for them to speak about. And for them to invalidate those pictures, they have to get into some pretty hardy conspiracy theories. But the truth is that your observations of the world, you don't really know, most likely, unless you have studied celestial mechanics. You probably don't know how things would be different if, in fact, the earth was flat in terms of your own personal observations. And, you know, it's pretty clear that that's true because it took humanity like thousands of years to figure this out. It's not so obvious. It's pretty difficult. So there's something laudable about the flat earthers, which is they don't just take someone else's word for it. They sort of question. And so that questioning aspect is kind of laudable. Of course, it leads them into a really crazy position about the world. But what I like about this example is just that the psychology here is really rich and interesting and complex. And it's not so much a matter of these folks just being a bunch of crazy people. Now, I will say that some of them are crazy people because we ran into plenty of crazy people at the conference. But I would say most of them are not. Most of them are not. Most of them are like you and I, and they're pretty thoughtful people. So I just find this really, really fascinating. Okay, I'm going to start getting into wrapping up here, and what I think some of the takeaways should be as we start heading into this really difficult election season, where I'm sure, regardless of which side of the aisle you are on right now, you're feeling a lot of exasperation and despair about our political climate, and there's no doubt that things are really difficult. A lot of these tendencies that I'm showing are being exacerbated by the way that we're getting information now on social media and so on. And our polarization is just getting worse and worse and worse. And we just can't see eye to eye on anything. And we argue about everything across the aisle. And everybody says, well, I really want politicians in there who are going to try to bridge that divide, but we just have no idea as a society how to make it happen. Instead, we go on Facebook and we just click on the things that we like, and we affiliate only with people on our side, and we watch cable news and all this kind of stuff, and it just makes things worse and worse and worse. I'm just going to give you three sort of ideas about the way that I think you as an individual might help engage in more productive debate and discourse around these issues. One is to change our mindset when we get into when we're talking about a policy issue. And the change in mindset, I call explain rather than advocate. Most of the time when we're engaged in discourse around policy issues, we want to convince the other person that we're right and they're wrong. We want to advocate for our ideas, and that's very natural. And that's what we do. That's what politicians do, right? That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get people on our side. Now, you as an individual, your goal should not necessarily be to get people on your side. I think it should be to help to try to understand issues better and to try to figure out get a better, deeper understanding of like what kind of policy issues might actually help advance your interests, and then also to try to understand what other people kind of want. Like why do they promote the position that they promote? Are they just mistaken? And sometimes they are. Or is it that the issue might be more complicated than you thought it was, and in fact there might be more than one way to get to the right position, or there might be trade-offs that you weren't thinking about inherent in the policy, where your position necessitates some trade-offs that you weren't thinking, and so on. So if we get into more of this explanatory mindset, it can help us to be a little bit more calibrated. Rather than trying to say this is the way it should be, maybe we should try to be learning a little bit more about why the other side, like what's the best example, what's the best argument for a different position than the one that we have. And what we should do is try to instead of arguing, try to engage in this kind of explanatory mindset where we try to go deeper and figure out where the holes in our own knowledge are. And often what that'll do is it'll have the effect of kind of opening us up and helping us to realize that reality might be more complex than we initially thought, okay? That's idea number one. Engage in this explanatory rather than advocacy mindset. The next idea is to take a more generous perspective towards people on the other side. And I know this can be really hard, and I totally understand that. There are people who are bad actors, especially people on the extremes on both sides, who are trying to sow discord and who are trying to obscure the truth. But it's actually the case that most people in the middle on both sides are not bad actors. And our minds usually go to one of two places. One, this person has bad intent. That is, they want bad things. They have bad values. Or they're stupid. They just don't see reality as well as I do. And I would argue that if you back off and you sort of inhibit that initial reaction, those two initial reactions, there's a good chance they're probably not correct. It's actually very likely that the person that you're engaged with is just as smart as you are and has just as good intentions as you do. Not always, but often. And if we start with that perspective, this person is as smart as I am, and they're as good as I am, and they're as nice as I am, then it might give you a different perspective, and it might help you realize that, in fact, their position might be born of ignorance, but that ignorance is kind of part and parcel of this dynamics that I taught you about today, of how knowledge is stored in the community. And so it's, in effect, like not really their fault, and what you should be doing is not getting mad at them, but helping to sort of engage in this process where you might help them to see that the issue is more complex. Now, this is a little bit optimistic of a view, and optimism doesn't always work, especially in these dark times. So, maybe this won't work all the time. And especially if you're arguing with someone on Facebook, maybe they're just a jerk, and maybe they aren't smart. Maybe they're not capable of sort of self-reflection. But guess what? Maybe they are. And I think getting in that perspective of being more generous is a really good first starting point. It also can lead to a lot less unpleasantness at the Thanksgiving tables. So I'll give you a little bit of a starting point for Thanksgiving this year, if you guys are going to have a Zoom Thanksgiving dinner and you don't want to argue. Okay, last point before we get to Q&A is I think there's this general idea of intellectual humility that I've been promoting here. This is something that human beings by their nature are not very good at. We tend to overestimate how well we understand things, as I've been showing you, so it doesn't come naturally to us. But we can sort of teach ourselves to engage habitually in intellectual humility. And what that just means is we need to be questioning, do I understand this as well as I thought I did? Oftentimes, if you're a teacher or you're trying to teach people a concept, you often find, oh, wow, actually, this is harder than I thought. So getting in that habit is very unnatural, but it's something that you can learn and teach yourself. And the effect is that it can make you a little bit more calibrated. Doesn't necessarily mean you should back off all your positions and you should say, well, maybe the earth is flat. No, that's not what I'm advocating for. But what you should say is, wow, this issue might be more complex and I might be missing something. So let's be a little more careful. And by the way, let's not just blindly reshare that super aggressive article on Facebook just because it came from someone that I trust. Maybe I should be a little more deliberative about making sure that that person has their facts straight. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to, I think, turn it over to Amanda to get the Q&A going, and I'm happy to elaborate on anything that you guys saw. Thank you. Oh, let me say one more thing, which is, let me plug my book, The Knowledge Illusion, Why We Never Think Alone. If you are interested in these ideas that I talked about today, and if you're interested in cognitive science and how it can apply to our lives and issues like our decision-making, our educational systems, how we interact with technology, how we engage in our political discourse and so on, I definitely encourage you to pick up a copy of the book, and I am more than happy to sign a copy of it for you. Once the pandemic's over, I'll come over to your house, okay? So pick up a copy. I would love for you guys to get deeper into this. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Phil. We are moving into Q&A now. As a reminder, please submit your questions via the Q&A interface. And the first question is actually here from Deanna about your book. She wondered, is your book on Audible?
Deanna, I love starting with easy questions, and the answer is yes. I would love for you to buy it on Audible.
Great. Thank you for that. All right, quite a few questions streaming in. One question we have here from Carrie. She asks, how much does the knowledge illusion impinge on our social agency? How do we become more aware of our own limits of understanding?
Yeah, totally. I didn't 100% understand the first part of the question, so I'll just sort of reiterate what I said for the second part of the question, which is that if we get into this habit, I've actually taught myself to do this through the course of my research. I've actually learned to calibrate myself better, and it's through this habitual practice of questioning yourself and questioning your understanding. Now, you don't want to take this too far, because there are certain cases where it's actually pretty good to be overconfident. Like if you're starting a new business, you do want to have some decent calibration so you don't increase your risk profile beyond where you're comfortable. So you want to be a little careful there. But you also don't want to think too hard about what might go wrong, because sometimes you just got to jump into things with 2 feet. But in general, I think intellectual humility can really help us to be better at forecasting the future, to be better at talking to other people, and getting to some sort of a consensus or getting to some sort of a deeper understanding. So this habitual practice of saying, do I understand this issue as well as I thought I did, is really, really useful. Sort of do the toilet experiment to yourself, and do that all the time. And you'll find, I think, a lot of the time, the world is really, really complex. Even things that seem simple have hidden layers of complexity, and that's what we learn when we engage in this intellectual humility exercise.
Great, thank you for that. We've gotten this next question 3 times, most recently from Diana. How do we have a discussion when someone supports their knowledge based on a biblical verse? For example, the Bible says so, case closed.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. And the idea is that there are, I actually have research on this that I didn't show you today. We talk about a difference between a values-based and a consequence-based attitude. A values-based attitude means that I believe this because it's right or wrong. Regardless, I don't care about what the consequences are of this policy. It's just right or wrong. And oftentimes, those kind of values are derived from a biblical position. Now, a consequence-based position derives from more sort of like what I think is going to happen if this policy is instituted. And that's the more typical sort of stuff that we want to argue about, right? Like, I think if we do X, like Y is going to happen. You think Z is going to happen. And therefore we have a difference of opinion. Now that's easier to adjudicate, or to come to some sort of consensus view on. You are never going to convince somebody that they're right or wrong if they have a biblical mandate for believing what they do, okay? So that should not be an argument where you try to convince somebody that they're wrong about that, because people are entitled to their values. However, sometimes when we think we have a values-based position on something, it actually stops us from thinking deeper about the issue. And we stop and we just say, this is wrong, or this is correct. And I don't have to think deeper about the issue. But in fact, it might stop you from thinking that, well, actually the issue is more complicated. And so when we think something is values-based, sometimes it's not completely values-based for us. So let me give you an example. Now, say that you are somebody who is a real animal rights advocate, and you don't like the idea of hunting. And I tell you that there's this policy that's been instituted to allow hunting in an African country, and the proceeds go to conservation. Now, a values-based position might say, hunting is terrible, I don't want to allow it. And you might have a good argument there. But it's also possible that if you knew that those conservation efforts actually improve the numbers of species in that country, well, maybe you would think differently about it. Maybe not. You might just still think full stop hunting is wrong and you'd be entitled to that view, but you might actually think differently and realize, oh, actually it's more complicated. So the idea is that if someone expresses a values-based position to you based on a biblical mandate, if it's something that they truly believe is a moral issue for them, full stop, you shouldn't try to convince them they're wrong, because they're entitled to their opinion, I believe. But you should maybe help them see that maybe they're not seeing all the angles of the issue, because that's possible too. I hope that answer helps.
That was great. Thank you so much, Phil. This next question we've received from 2 attendees, most recently from Doug. He says, when does cognitive collaboration become dangerous, as in group think? For example, Lord of the Flies.
That's great. Yeah, totally. When you're the guy on the island or the gal on the island, yes, that's when that's when the rubber hits the road for sure. We go through many examples in our book of the dark side. We actually start the book with one of my favorite examples of all, which was this Castle Bravo nuclear test in the 1950s, when they were testing hydrogen bombs. Hydrogen bombs being orders of magnitude more powerful than what was dropped in Hiroshima, because they rely on a fusion rather than a fission mechanism. And they were testing these things in the South Pacific, and they accidentally irradiated some atolls in the South Pacific. And those atolls are still not habitable. And they basically destroyed the home of thousands of native peoples, killed tons of people. And it all had to do with the fact that the scientists didn't understand the fissile properties of the elements that they were using, and they also didn't completely understand the wind patterns and so on. So it was just like really complicated thing, and that's a pretty dramatic example. And we have many, many such examples where you can have very, very bad outcomes. I mean, you don't have to look far to understanding how things like authoritarianism and fascism and so on are possible. And that's one thing, which is that it's very hard from the outside to understand how these things are possible, because we think of ourselves as human beings as generally good and rational. And yet you get these incredible situations where you get large groups of people engaging in really, really, from a historical viewpoint, really incredibly despicable and horrible behaviors. And we don't really understand from a distance how that is possible. So your question is a really important one. And my, like what we talk about in the book, I don't think is probably the only answer, but it's part of the story. It's a really important part, I think.
Great. Thank you. And taking a look at the time, we're going to move into our final 2 questions. The second to last question here is from Hayden, who asks, how can we best combat, even within ourselves, the desire to reach for a conspiracy theory or pseudoscience to explain complicated parts of our world?
Oh, yeah. So conspiracy theories are very alluring. And the reason that conspiracy theories are so alluring is because what we do is we get this kind of aha moment. In cognitive psychology, we talk about it as coherence. when the pieces fit together, it feels really good. We sort of go, oh man, that explains everything. And when we get that feeling, what we forget is the sort of unlikelihood of the component parts. We sort of negate that part of it. So what you got to do is you got to look at the whole picture. You got to say, okay, this kind of fits together really well, but what has to be true in all these pieces for this thing to actually work? And you often find out that a lot of things have to be true, and it's pretty complicated. The other piece is, what happens is we engage in a kind of, and this is what I observed with the flat earthers, is that we engage in what we call a biased assimilation of evidence. And so once we believe that something is true or might be true, the evidence we start looking at, we interpret everything with respect to that idea. And so if some evidence seems to speak against our idea, we say, oh, I can't really trust it. And when it speaks in favor of our idea, we sort of blindly accept it as true without subjecting it to seriously looking at whether it's valid or not. That's called the biased assimilation of evidence. So you have to engage in a more scientific evaluation of the evidence. And what that could involve would be sort of pre-committing to a theory or a hypothesis about which way the data have to come out before you look at the data. And I think that that's kind of another good thing to do. So two pieces. One is, do not place so much weight on this coherence of the ideas. And number two, make sure that you're doing an even-handed evaluation of the evidence. That's very hard to do, but you at least should be aware of it and really push yourself in that direction of trying to see both sides.
Okay, great, thank you. And our final question for today comes from Casey. Do you think society today is more inclined to become more educated on issues, or simply abdicate to party or religious affiliation? If the latter, how do we motivate society to become better informed?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I actually am not a believer that human nature has fundamentally changed. I think, actually, I have some great examples that I'll show you about. Sometimes you look at these examples of, in our data of, people like, significant portions of people having like very low science literacy. And you're like, oh my God, what's wrong with people today? And then I have data going back to like the 1950s, and it's just as bad. It's exactly the same. These things I talked about are really fundamental to the way the mind works, and there are not things that have changed over time. What has changed, I think, that's making things worse is the weaponization of social media to kind of to increase our polarization. And so I don't think that people are less thoughtful today. I think it's always been this way, but I think that overall things are getting worse because we've gotten better, and our leaders have gotten better at sort of engaging in this divisive targeting of information to different groups, and our abilities to affiliate online with our ideological interest groups. And I think that that is something that will not be solved until society kind of wraps its head around how to, from the top down, sort of intervene on that problem. I actually, I don't want to end the webinar on a pessimistic note, but this is the part of the puzzle that makes me really, really nervous. I actually do not have any concerns about the general goodness or intelligence of human beings. What I am concerned about is the ability, if we don't get our hands around this, for information technology to be weaponized in a way that really leads to major, major problems for our society going forward. So I hope that we can figure out how to do this. And what I would say is that in the interim and in the meantime, while we're waiting for those things and trying to figure it out as a society how to fix it, what we can do as individuals is sort of this grassroots stuff that I talked about today, which is trying to engage in more intellectually humble comportment on a day-to-day basis. So I think that that is a good thought to wrap up on, because I think that is the optimistic end. And I hope everybody got some good information out of this. It's really weird to sit here and just talk to myself for an hour, but I really hope that that this was useful for you.
Great. Well, thank you so much to everyone for joining us for today's presentation. And thank you again to Phil for this great information. At this time, we invite you to provide your feedback on the webinar by answering the following poll question. On a scale from 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend this webinar to a friend or other CU Boulder alumni? We thank you in advance for submitting your feedback. As a reminder, all webinar attendees will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording of this presentation as well as a survey. To view upcoming webinars as well as previous recordings, please visit our website at colorado.edu/business/alumni. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is this Thursday, as Professor and Chair of Literacy Studies in the School of Education, Dr. Elizabeth Dutro, presents on the complexities of trauma and education in the time of COVID-19. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day. Thank you for your time, and as always, go Buffs!